Trusting God is at the heart of a life of faith. But what does it really mean to trust God? To trust God is to acknowledge that His wisdom, His knowledge, and His understanding far exceed our own. It's not just about believing in God's existence, but about surrendering our will, our desires, and our understanding to His greater plan. Trusting God involves letting go of control and stepping into His hands with confidence, knowing He sees the bigger picture when we can only see a small part. We live in a world where trust can often be a fragile thing. We are trained to trust our senses, our logic, and the world around us to guide us. And yet, the essence of faith is the belief that God's ways are higher than our ways. There are moments in life when we're faced with challenges that seem insurmountable, when the road ahead is unclear, and when our hearts are full of questions. This is where the rubber meets the road in our walk with God. It's in those moments when trusting God becomes a conscious decision, a decision to believe that, even in the darkest times, He is working behind the scenes for our good. We must remember that trusting God doesn't mean we have all the answers. In fact, it often means we don't have the answers at all. It's trusting that He knows best, even when the situation doesn't make sense. Just like a child trusts their parent, even when they don't understand why they're being asked to do something, we as children of God are called to trust our Heavenly Father, knowing He loves us and has a plan for us, even if we can't always see it. But trust isn't just passive. It requires action. It requires stepping out in faith, even when the next step is unclear. Sometimes we want certainty before we take action, but faith, real trust in God, often calls us to move forward, even when we don't have all the details. When we choose to trust God, we are actively participating in the unfolding of His plan for our lives. And in doing so, we make space for God to move in ways that we couldn't have imagined. Trusting God also means that we embrace His timing. In our human nature, we are often impatient, wanting things to happen on our terms and according to our schedule. But God operates on a different timeline, one that is perfect in every way. Our impatience may lead us to take matters into our own hands, but trusting in God's timing means acknowledging that He knows the best moment for everything to fall into place. It's in that waiting that our trust in Him is refined, and we learn to rely on His timing, which is always better than our own. It's important to remember that trusting God isn't something that happens overnight. It's a journey that requires continuous growth. The more we experience His faithfulness, the more our trust in Him deepens. And as we grow in our trust, we begin to see His work unfolding in ways that we never expected. His plans, though hidden at times, always lead us to a place of abundance and peace. As we continue this journey of trusting God, it's vital to recognize that this trust isn't blind, it's based on relationship. The more we walk with God, the more we get to know His character. We learn that He is good, that He is faithful, and that His love for us is unconditional. It's this deep personal relationship with Him that strengthens our trust. When we know God, we can trust Him completely because we know He has our best interest at heart. Trusting God is not always easy, especially when the storms of life come our way. But when we choose to trust Him, we tap into a power greater than ourselves. We open ourselves to His guidance, His wisdom, and His peace. And when we truly trust, we begin to see the beauty of His plan unfolding in ways we could never have imagined. So as we move forward in our lives, let's remember that trusting God's ways is not just a one-time decision, it's a lifestyle. It's a daily choice to lay down our own understanding and embrace His perfect will. And when we do this, we will watch as His ways begin to come running toward us, bringing with them the blessings, the peace, and the purpose He has prepared for us. And that's the beauty of trusting God. When we trust His ways, we begin to see them unfold before us. And we experience the fullness of His love and grace. When we speak about trusting God's ways, it's important to understand that His ways are not just different from ours. They are often beyond our human comprehension. We live in a world that demands logic, evidence, and immediate understanding. We want to know why things happen the way they do, and we often want answers right away. But God operates on a level that transcends our limited human perspective. His wisdom, His knowledge, His understanding are infinite. When we trust in God's ways, we are choosing to place our confidence in the fact that His plan for us is far greater than anything we could come up with ourselves. Think about how often we can become frustrated when life doesn't go the way we expect. We may face setbacks, heartache, or times of confusion, and we can't understand why these things are happening. Yet when we look back, we often realize that God was working behind the scenes in ways we couldn't have foreseen. His ways are higher than ours, and in His wisdom, He allows things to unfold in the perfect timing and manner that we could never have imagined. It's this understanding of God's superior wisdom that gives us the strength to trust Him, even when we don't have all the answers. One of the hardest things we face in trusting God is the reality that we don't always get to know the why behind what is happening in our lives. God doesn't always give us a roadmap or a blueprint for our journey. Instead, He calls us to trust His direction, even when we can't see the full picture. This is where faith comes into play. Faith is trusting that even when we don't understand the steps ahead, we can trust that God knows exactly where He's leading us. His perspective is eternal, while ours is limited by time and circumstance. The Bible tells us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and His ways are not our ways. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This is a powerful reminder that God's understanding far exceeds ours, and because of this, we must trust in His plan, even when it doesn't make sense to us in the moment. Sometimes we are like children who cannot understand the reasons behind what their parents are doing. A child might resist being told to do something because they don't see the bigger picture, but the parent, with a broader view and more experience, sees the outcome and understands why the child needs to follow their direction. In a similar way, God, as our Father, sees things from a perspective we cannot. He sees the entirety of our lives, the events, the people, the choices, and the circumstances that we can't possibly fathom. His love for us compels Him to guide us, even if we don't immediately grasp the reasons behind His direction. Trusting in God's ways also requires humility. It's an acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers and we cannot control everything. It's the surrender of our own understanding to the higher wisdom of God. When we trust in His ways, we are saying, God, I may not understand why this is happening, but I know You are good, and I trust that You are leading me in the right direction. This act of surrender is often difficult because it goes against our natural instincts to control our own destinies. But in reality, it is only through trusting God's ways that we truly find peace and fulfillment. Moreover, God's ways are not just about wisdom, they are about love. God's plans for us are always motivated by His deep love for His creation. Sometimes we might question why certain things happen, why things don't go according to our plans. Yet God's love for us is constant, and His plans are always for our ultimate good. Even in the most difficult circumstances, His love remains unwavering, and His purposes will not fail. We may not see the immediate benefit of His ways, but over time, as we look back, we often realize that God's plan was unfolding in the best way possible. In our human perspective, we may see things as delays, obstacles, or detours. But God, in His wisdom, may be using those very moments to shape us, strengthen us, and prepare us for what lies ahead. The delays that seem frustrating at the time may actually be God's way of protecting us or guiding us to something better. In the same way, the hardships we face can be opportunities for us to grow in faith and trust, learning to depend on Him more fully. When we are willing to trust God's ways, we are also acknowledging that He is sovereign. His control over all things is absolute, and His plan is perfect. Even when it feels like life is chaotic or out of control, we can rest in the assurance that God is sovereign over every detail. Nothing happens outside of His knowledge or control. His ways may seem mysterious or confusing in the moment, but we can take comfort in knowing that He is in control and His plan for our lives is unfolding exactly as it should. At times, trusting God's ways can feel like walking in the dark, uncertain of what's ahead. But in those moments, we are reminded that God is the light that guides our path. Even in times of confusion or uncertainty, His presence brings clarity and peace. And as we continue to trust Him, His ways become clearer, and we begin to see His hand in the unfolding of our lives. Over time, we find that the more we trust God's ways, the more we experience His faithfulness, and the more we grow in our understanding of His perfect plan. So as we trust in God's ways, we are called to remember that His wisdom is beyond our comprehension. His love is never ending, and His plan for us is always for our good. We may not always understand what He is doing in the moment, but we can trust that He is leading us exactly where we need to go. And in His perfect timing, we will see the beauty of His plan unfold, just as He intended. When we talk about trusting God's ways, especially through life's challenges, we acknowledge a fundamental truth. Trusting God is not always easy. It requires an active decision to hold on to faith, even when things don't seem to be going our way. It's in the midst of adversity, pain, and confusion that our trust in God is truly tested. But it is also in these very moments that we often experience the most profound growth in our faith. Life is full of challenges, times when we face situations that leave us feeling overwhelmed, uncertain, or helpless. Whether it's a personal loss, a health crisis, financial struggles, or relationship difficulties, we are all familiar with the times when the weight of our problems feels unbearable. And in those moments, the natural human response is to question, to worry, and to try to find a solution on our own. But the call to trust God's ways is especially crucial during these moments of trial. God never promises us a life free of difficulties. In fact, He tells us that we will face tribulations. Jesus Himself said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world." What He does promise, however, is His presence through the struggles and the assurance that He is working all things together for our good, even when we cannot see how. This is where the foundation of trusting God's ways becomes a lifeline in times of challenge. Trusting God through life's difficulties doesn't mean that we won't experience pain or hardship. It doesn't mean that everything will always go according to our plan. Rather, it means that we choose to trust that God is still good, still in control, and still working for our good, even when circumstances feel bleak. It's an active choice to believe that God's purpose in our lives remains unchanged, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. In these moments, trusting God's ways means we let go of our own plans and expectations and open ourselves to what He is doing, even when we can't fully understand it. This is not easy. It's tempting to want to take matters into our own hands when we don't see immediate solutions, to try to force things to work according to our own will. But the key to trusting God's ways is surrendering our desire for control and recognizing that God's wisdom far exceeds ours. For example, when someone is dealing with a difficult diagnosis or an unexpected loss, the emotions are real and the pain is deep. In those moments, trusting God doesn't mean pretending to have it all together or ignoring the emotions. Rather, it means leaning into God with our pain, trusting that He is there with us in the midst of it. It's choosing to believe that His purposes are still being worked out, even when we can't see them. And often, it's in those broken, vulnerable moments that we experience God's love and comfort in ways that strengthen our faith in Him. When life is hard, we are often tempted to look for quick fixes or shortcuts that promise immediate relief. But trusting God's ways means trusting His timing and His methods, even when they don't align with our own. God's timeline doesn't always match ours, and His ways of working things out don't always look the way we expect. But He knows what we need better than we do, and His ways are always higher and more beneficial than anything we can plan. Consider the example of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. In their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, they faced hunger, thirst, and opposition. They didn't understand why God was leading them the way He was, and at times they doubted His plan. But God was working in the wilderness, refining them, teaching them dependence on Him, and preparing them for the blessings ahead. What seemed like a detour was actually part of His perfect plan to shape them into the people they were meant to be. In our own lives, God sometimes leads us through seasons that feel like a wilderness, times when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. But even in those seasons, God is at work. He is teaching us, molding us, and preparing us for what's ahead. Trusting Him through the hard times means recognizing that He is not absent, He is not indifferent, and He is not unaware of our pain. His ways may be beyond our understanding, but His presence is always with us. Another key to trusting God through life's challenges is recognizing that we are not meant to go through them alone. God has surrounded us with His presence and with a community of believers who can help carry the burden. During times of difficulty, reaching out to others for support and prayer is part of trusting God's ways. It's a reminder that we are part of a larger body and we are never alone in our struggles. Trusting God's ways also involves trusting the people He has placed in our lives to help us, support us, and remind us of His promises when we are struggling to believe them ourselves. Through each challenge, we learn more about God's faithfulness. There is a saying that goes, God doesn't waste pain. Every difficulty we face can serve as a stepping stone for greater trust in God. As we see time and time again that He has been faithful in carrying us through, it's through the trials that we often learn to rely more deeply on His strength and less on our own. Trusting God through life's challenges allows us to see His provision, His peace, and His power in ways that we might never have experienced otherwise. Ultimately, trusting God through life's challenges means understanding that He is always working for our good. Even when life doesn't go according to our plan, we can trust that God is still in control and that He is using every moment to shape us into the people He has called us to be. It means trusting that even when we cannot see how things will work out, God is already at work in the background preparing the way. As we face the challenges of life, we can take heart in the truth that God's ways are always better than our own. His purposes are always for our good, and He is with us every step of the way. When we choose to trust God through life's difficulties, we experience His peace that surpasses understanding, and we begin to see His plan unfold in ways that will surprise and bless us. One of the most challenging aspects of trusting God's ways is understanding His timing. We live in a world where everything seems to operate on an immediate timeline. We want things to happen quickly, and we often find ourselves impatient when things don't move according to our schedule. We're used to instant gratification, whether it's through technology, services, or even social interactions. We expect to have what we want when we want it. But God's timing is different. His understanding of time is beyond our own, and often His perfect timing is a lesson in patience, trust, and waiting on His will. The Bible is filled with examples that show us the importance of God's timing. Take, for instance, the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child, but years passed and they saw no sign of the fulfillment of that promise. In their impatience, they tried to take matters into their own hands, and we know that the result was not what God had intended. The promise of Isaac, the child of their old age, seemed impossible in their eyes, and they questioned whether God would ever deliver. Yet in His perfect timing, God brought that promise to fruition. At the exact moment He had planned, Sarah became pregnant and Isaac was born. Abraham and Sarah had to wait for years, but when God fulfilled His promise, it was far beyond what they could have imagined. This story teaches us that God's timing is always perfect. Even when it feels like we are waiting too long or that the door is never going to open, God is never late. His plan is not bound by the clock or calendar the way ours are. When we trust in His timing, we acknowledge that He knows exactly when we are ready to receive His blessings and when those blessings will be most impactful. This means we don't always get what we want or even what we think we need at the time we think we need it, but instead we get it when we are truly prepared to receive it. One reason it can be hard to trust God's timing is because it's often different from our own. We might want a solution today or a breakthrough tomorrow, but God's timing is more about His divine purpose and our spiritual growth than it is about our convenience. Sometimes God asks us to wait because there are things He wants to work out in our hearts and in our lives. Maybe we need to develop patience, or perhaps there's something we need to learn in the process. Waiting is not just about time, it's about trust. It's about trusting that even though we can't see the end result, God is working on our behalf and His plan will be worth the wait. There's also something deeply transformative in waiting. When we trust God's timing, we grow in our ability to rely on Him. We learn to lean into Him for strength and comfort while we wait. The waiting period isn't just about hoping for something to change. It's about developing a deeper relationship with God, trusting that He is present with us in the waiting, and recognizing that He is in control of the timing. Waiting on God is an act of faith, and through it, we learn to rest in the assurance that His timing will bring about the best outcome, even if we don't fully understand it at the moment. Consider the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph was given a dream by God where his brothers and parents would bow down to him. He had this dream as a young man, full of hope and excitement about the future. Yet the journey to the fulfillment of that dream was far from easy. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, wrongfully imprisoned, and endured years of hardship before the dream came true. From a human perspective, Joseph's life was filled with delays and detours. But in God's perfect timing, Joseph was elevated to a position of great power in Egypt, and the very brothers who had sold him were eventually the ones who bowed to him, fulfilling the dream that God had given him. If Joseph had been given that position of power earlier in his life, he may not have been ready for it, and the story of God's faithfulness and redemption would have looked very different. This example shows us that sometimes God allows us to go through difficult seasons, not as a punishment, but as preparation. His timing ensures that we are fully ready to handle the blessings He is preparing for us. The time in the waiting, in the refining, shapes us and prepares us for the future God has for us. Trusting God's timing is a reminder that His ways are higher than ours and that His delays are not denials. It's also important to note that God's timing often works to bring about the best results for others as well. We may not always see it, but our waiting serves a greater purpose than just our own personal development. God is working in the lives of those around us too. He is aligning circumstances, bringing people into our lives at just the right time, and working behind the scenes in ways we cannot always understand. In the same way that Joseph's story was a part of God's bigger plan to save an entire nation, our waiting can be part of a larger divine design that impacts others in ways we cannot foresee. The truth is, while we may want to rush ahead, take matters into our own hands, God's timing always works out for the best. It's during the waiting periods of our lives that we learn to trust Him the most. It is when we don't have the answers or when the breakthrough seems far off that we discover how deep our trust can truly go. Waiting is not wasted time when it is spent in faith, knowing that God is at work even when we can't see it. The challenge of trusting God's timing is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile. His plan for our lives is infinitely more beautiful and fulfilling than anything we could plan for ourselves. And so we are called to wait patiently, to trust His perfect timing, and to rest in the knowledge that He is always working for our good. God is never late. He is always on time. When we trust in His timing, we allow Him to lead us to the place He has prepared for us. And when that time comes, we will see that it was worth the wait. As we learn to trust God's timing, we are not only becoming more patient, but we are also becoming more attuned to His voice, more sensitive to His lead, and more able to discern His plan for our lives. Trusting in His timing means trusting in His goodness, His love, and His faithfulness, and that trust transforms our waiting into an act of worship. And in the end, when the fulfillment of His promises comes, it will be more than we could have ever imagined. Trusting God's ways is not just about waiting for things to unfold in our lives. It's about knowing that God is at work in every detail, even when we can't see it. The fifth key point of trusting God's ways is understanding that His ways often exceed our expectations. When we trust Him fully, we come to realize that God's plans are so much bigger, so much better than we could ever imagine. This is an important truth that we must grasp in our faith journey, because it reminds us that the limitations we place on ourselves and our expectations do not apply to God. What we consider impossible, He makes possible. One of the challenges we face is that we often view our lives through a limited lens. We look at our circumstances, our abilities, and our resources, and we base our expectations on what we think we can do. We plan and dream, and we work hard to make things happen. But God is not limited by what we see as possible. He is a God of abundance, a God who can accomplish more than we could ever ask or think. Ephesians 3:20 reminds us, now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us. This verse tells us that God's capacity to bless, to lead, to guide, and to provide is beyond our wildest dreams. Take, for example, the story of David. David was a young shepherd boy, overlooked by his family and dismissed as too young and inexperienced to be considered for leadership. But God saw something in David that no one else did. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint a king for Israel, David was the last person his father Jesse thought of. But God's ways were different. God didn't look at David's size, his age, or his inexperience. He looked at David's heart. God called David to be the future king of Israel. And through David's trust in God's ways, God did things in and through David that no one could have predicted. David's rise to the throne was not a straightforward path. It was filled with challenges, obstacles, and even betrayal. But through it all, God was at work. He was preparing David, refining him, and using every difficult moment to shape him into the leader that Israel needed. And when David became king, he experienced the fulfillment of promises far beyond what he could have expected when he was just a shepherd boy. This story is a powerful reminder that God's plans and His ways often exceed what we could ever imagine. Another story that illustrates how God's ways exceed our expectations is the story of Moses. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household, and after fleeing Egypt, he spent years in the wilderness as a shepherd. But at a time when Moses had likely given up on any notion of greatness or leadership, God called him to deliver His people from slavery. Moses questioned God's choice, citing his own inadequacies, but God knew exactly what He was doing. In the end, God worked in and through Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, performing miracles that no one could have anticipated. Moses' life shows us that God does not choose us based on our qualifications or abilities, but on His purpose and His plan for us. When we trust in His ways, we discover that He is able to do far more than we could have ever expected or imagined. Trusting God's ways also means letting go of our own timelines and agendas and embracing His perfect plans. We often want things to happen according to our own schedule. We want answers right away, solutions to come quickly, and obstacles to disappear. But God doesn't work on our timeline. His ways are often slower, more deliberate, and more expansive than we think they should be. Yet in His perfect timing, His plans unfold in ways that exceed our expectations. They are far better than anything we could have orchestrated on our own. His timing brings out the fullness of His plan, ensuring that when the moment arrives, everything is in place. God had promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of peace and prosperity. Yet their journey took 40 years, a long and difficult period of wandering in the wilderness. Along the way, they faced trials, doubts, and setbacks. At times, they questioned God's promises. But through it all, God's ways were working in them, refining their faith, teaching them to trust in Him, and preparing them for the blessings that lay ahead. When they finally entered the promised land, it was not just about reaching a physical location. It was about the transformation that had taken place in their hearts. God's ways, although different from what they might have expected, were ultimately for their good and His glory. In our own lives, we often face situations that don't make sense or that seem to take longer than we had hoped. But God's plans always exceed our expectations because His goal is not just to meet our desires. His goal is to shape us into the people we are meant to be. We may want immediate results, but God's ways involve a process of growth, maturity, and deepening trust. When we trust Him, we begin to understand that the journey is just as important as the destination. Additionally, God's ways often exceed our expectations in terms of His provision. Time and time again, we see in Scripture that God provides exactly what His people need at just the right time in ways that go beyond what they could have imagined. In the wilderness, God provided manna from heaven to feed the Israelites. When they were thirsty, He provided water from a rock. These provisions were not just enough, they were miraculous. God's provision is not limited by our resources, our circumstances, or our understanding. He is able to provide for us in ways that we couldn't have expected, often in surprising and creative ways. In our own lives, we may find ourselves in situations where we don't know how the bills will be paid, how a relationship will be healed, or how a dream will come to fruition. But when we trust God's ways, we recognize that He is able to provide for us in ways we can't foresee. We learn to trust not in our own ability to provide, but in God's infinite capacity to supply what we need, both physically and spiritually. As we grow in our faith and our trust in God, we start to realize that His ways are always better than ours. They surpass our expectations in terms of what He accomplishes through us and what He gives us. When we choose to trust God, we open ourselves up to His amazing, unexpected work in our lives. What may seem impossible or unlikely becomes possible when we place our trust in Him. The beauty of trusting God's ways is that we are not confined to our own limited thinking and abilities. God's plan, His purpose, and His provision will always exceed anything we could have imagined on our own. As we trust in His ways, we begin to see how His plans unfold in ways that are not only better than we could have hoped, but more fulfilling and rewarding than anything we could have created on our own. And in that process, we come to experience the fullness of His love, His faithfulness, and His goodness. When we talk about trusting God's ways, we must also understand the significance of surrendering our control. One of the biggest barriers to fully trusting God is our need for control. As human beings, we like to be in charge, to make decisions, and to know exactly what will happen and when. We live in a world where we are encouraged to plan, organize, and take matters into our own hands to ensure success. But God calls us to a different way of living a life of surrender, where we release our control and trust in His sovereign will. Surrendering control is not something that comes naturally to us. It goes against the grain of human instinct. In fact, it's often one of the hardest things to do in the Christian faith because it requires us to give up our own desires, our own plans, and sometimes our own sense of security. However, true trust in God's ways is rooted in this surrender. Trusting God means recognizing that He is in control and we are not. It means choosing to follow His lead even when it seems uncertain or uncomfortable. When we surrender control, we stop trying to force things to happen according to our own will and instead allow God to shape the path before us. The Bible has countless examples of individuals who had to surrender their control in order to fully trust in God. One of the most powerful examples is the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. As Jesus faced the imminent pain and suffering of the cross, He prayed, "Father, if You are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but Yours be done." Luke 22:42. Jesus knew what lay ahead. He knew the agony, the rejection, and the crucifixion that awaited Him. Yet, in that moment of deep anguish, He surrendered His will to the Father's. He trusted that God's plan, even though it involved pain and sacrifice, was the right and good plan. This moment in the garden shows us the depth of trust that comes with surrender. Jesus didn't resist the plan or try to change it. Instead, He accepted God's will and placed His trust in the Father's ultimate wisdom and purpose. This surrender didn't take away the difficulty of the situation, but it allowed Jesus to move forward with confidence, knowing that God's ways were higher than His own. Surrendering to God's will doesn't always mean that our path will be easy or free of hardship. In fact, it may be the opposite. But it does mean that we are willing to trust God even when the path ahead is unclear or difficult. In our own lives, surrendering control can feel terrifying. We may not know what the future holds, and the unknown can be a source of anxiety. But when we surrender to God, we are acknowledging that we don't need to know every detail or have everything figured out. We are placing our trust in the One who does know the future, the One who is guiding us toward His perfect plan. Surrendering to God is an act of faith that acknowledges that His wisdom and love are far greater than our own. Surrender also involves letting go of the need for immediate results. Sometimes we want things to happen quickly, and when they don't, we take matters into our own hands. But God's ways are often different from ours. His timing is perfect, even when it feels like we are waiting too long. Surrendering to God's timing requires patience, trust, and a willingness to accept that things may not happen on our schedule. But in the waiting, we often grow in ways that we couldn't if we had rushed ahead. Surrendering control means allowing God to work in His time, not ours. Consider the story of Abraham and Sarah again. When God promised them a child, they were already advanced in age, and they didn't understand how it could happen. In their impatience, they tried to take control and make God's promise happen in their own way, leading to the birth of Ishmael. But that was not the plan God had in mind. He waited until the time was perfect. And when Isaac was born, it was a miracle that demonstrated God's faithfulness and timing. The key to that miracle was Abraham and Sarah's eventual willingness to surrender to God's plan, trusting that His timing would be best, even if it didn't match their expectations. Another aspect of surrendering control is letting go of our own ideas about what success looks like. We live in a world that often measures success by outward achievements, wealth, status, power, or personal accomplishments. But God's definition of success is different. His ways may involve seasons of waiting, quiet preparation, or even moments of apparent failure. Trusting God's ways means surrendering our own definitions of success and submitting to His. God may lead us down paths that don't make sense by the world's standards, but these paths are often the ones that shape us the most and bring about the greatest fruit. The Apostle Paul offers another example of surrender in his life. Paul was a man who once had everything: status, influence, and a sense of purpose in his religious zeal. But when God called him on the road to Damascus, he had to surrender everything: his former way of life, his reputation, and his understanding of God's will. Paul's surrender wasn't a one-time event, but a continual act throughout his life. He suffered beatings, imprisonment, and rejection, yet he remained faithful to God's call because he understood that true success was found in doing God's will, not his own. In Philippians 3:8, he wrote, "What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord." Paul's life was one of constant surrender to God's purpose, and in doing so, he experienced the joy of knowing Christ in a way that far surpassed any earthly gain. Surrendering control also means trusting God in the midst of uncertainty. In life, we are often faced with situations where the outcome is unclear and we don't have all the answers. We may be dealing with a difficult relationship, a job change, or a major life decision, and we have no idea what the right choice is. In these moments, God calls us to surrender our need for certainty and trust that He is leading us. We may not have all the answers, but we can trust that God does. When we surrender to Him, we allow His peace to fill us, even in the midst of the unknown. We stop striving, stop worrying, and simply trust that He will guide us through the uncertainty. Surrendering control is a lifelong process. It doesn't happen overnight and is something we must continually choose to do. But as we surrender more of our lives to God, we begin to experience His peace and His presence in deeper ways. We let go of the pressure to be in control and open ourselves up to God's perfect plan for our lives. The beauty of surrendering control is that it doesn't mean we are passive or inactive. Rather, it means we are actively trusting in God's ability to guide us. We still take steps of faith, still make decisions, and still follow God's leading. But we do so with an open hand, knowing that the outcome is ultimately in His hands. In surrendering control, we find freedom. We are freed from the burden of trying to make everything work on our own. We are freed from the fear of failure because we trust that God's ways are far greater than our own. And we are freed to experience the abundant life that comes from fully trusting in God's plan, even when it doesn't look like what we imagine. Trusting God's ways requires us to surrender control, to stop striving, and to allow God to lead us. It's in this surrender that we find the peace, joy, and purpose that come from following Him. When we surrender, we open ourselves up to the fullness of God's plan and experience His presence in a way that brings true fulfillment. It's in letting go that we truly begin to receive all that God has for you. Not trusting God's ways isn't just a matter of surrendering control or believing that He will eventually fulfill His promises. It's also about recognizing that sometimes God's direction for our lives leads us through difficult and even painful circumstances. The seventh key point in trusting God's ways is understanding that God's purposes often involve refining us through trials. This concept can be hard to accept because no one likes to face challenges, suffering, or hardship. Yet throughout Scripture, we see that God often allows these difficult moments to shape us, strengthen our faith, and draw us closer to Him. We live in a world where trials and difficulties can feel like a disruption to our lives, and it's natural to want to avoid them. But in God's kingdom, trials are not seen as obstacles to be avoided. They are opportunities for growth, refinement, and deeper trust in Him. The Bible is clear that while suffering is painful, it has a purpose in the life of the believer. James 1:2-4 encourages us by saying, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This passage reminds us that trials test our faith, but in doing so, they also refine it. When our faith is tested, we are given the opportunity to grow and become more like Christ. The result is maturity in our spiritual journey, a deeper trust in God's plan, and the ability to handle life's challenges with grace. But this process isn't always easy. It requires us to lean into God when we would rather retreat, to trust in His goodness even when life feels unbearable, and to hold on to His promises even when the outcome isn't clear. One example of how God uses trials to refine us can be found in the life of Job. Job was a man who had everything: wealth, health, a large family, and a strong faith. But in a matter of days, Job lost everything. His wealth vanished, his children died, and he was afflicted with painful sores. In the midst of his suffering, Job questioned God, struggled to understand why these things were happening to him. Yet throughout the book of Job, we see that God used Job's suffering to reveal deep truths about His sovereignty, His wisdom, and His goodness. Job's faith was tested to the core, and in the end, he was able to say, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you," Job 42:5. Job's suffering brought him into a deeper relationship with God. And through it, God was refining him into a man who truly understood God's greatness and his own dependence on Him. What we learn from Job's story is that trials do not have to be meaningless or purposeless. In fact, they can be some of the most profound moments in our faith journey. God uses suffering and hardship to shape our character, develop perseverance, and strengthen our relationship with Him. While we may not always understand why we are going through a particular trial, we can trust that God is at work, even in the midst of our pain. Another powerful example of how God uses trials to refine us is seen in the Apostle Paul's life. Paul, a man who was zealous for spreading the gospel, faced numerous hardships, beatings, imprisonments, shipwrecks, and constant opposition. In 2 Corinthians 12:7-10, Paul shares about a thorn in the flesh that God allowed to remain in his life. Paul pleaded with God 3 times to remove it, but God responded, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul, understanding that God's purposes were far greater than his own comfort, said, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul's suffering became a means of glorifying God, and through it, his faith grew stronger. In our own lives, we may face what feels like a thorn of persistent struggle that doesn't seem to go away. It may be a health issue, a difficult relationship, financial difficulties, or emotional pain. Just like Paul, we may wonder why God is allowing us to suffer, but God's response to us is the same: His grace is sufficient. Even when we don't understand the reasons behind our trials, we can trust that He is using them for His good purposes in our lives. Refining through trials doesn't only involve external circumstances, it also lurks within us. Often it's in our moments of greatest struggle that our faith is most tested. When everything seems to fall apart, we are forced to confront the reality of what we truly believe. Do we trust in God's goodness even when things don't go as planned? Do we believe that He is working for our good even when the situation feels overwhelming? The truth is, trials have a way of exposing what's in our hearts. When life is smooth, it's easy to say we trust God. But it's when the storms come that we truly discover the depth of our faith. The process of refinement through trials is a process of purifying our faith. In 1 Peter 1:6-7, Peter writes, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Just as gold is refined by fire, our faith is refined through trials. The fire burns away the impurities, leaving behind something more precious and pure. This process may be painful, but it's a necessary part of growing in our trust in God's ways. The refining process is also about preparation. Sometimes the trials we go through are not just for our own growth, but for a larger purpose. God may be preparing us for something greater that He has in store for us. In the story of Joseph, we see how God allowed Joseph to experience betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. At the time, Joseph could not understand why these things were happening, but God was using these experiences to prepare him for the day when he would rise to a position of power in Egypt and save his family from famine. Joseph's trials were not just about refining his character, but also about preparing him for God's ultimate purpose for his life. When we go through trials, it's important to remember that God may be preparing us for something far greater than we can imagine. One of the most difficult aspects of trusting God's ways through trials is knowing when the trial will end. Many times we wish we had a clear timeline or an understanding of how long we must endure. But God doesn't always give us that information. Instead, He asks us to trust Him in the process. Just like a potter working with clay, God is shaping us, molding us, and refining us often without us seeing the full picture. But we can trust that the potter knows exactly what he is doing. The process may take time, and it may involve more pain than we anticipated, but the end result is always worth it. In trusting God's ways, we come to realize that even in our trials, we are not alone. God walks with us through the fire. Isaiah 43:2 reminds us, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. God's presence in our trials is one of the greatest gifts He gives us. We can endure because He is with us, and His strength is made perfect in our weakness. So when we face trials and difficulties, instead of seeing them as obstacles to avoid, we can begin to see them as opportunities for refinement. We trust that God is using those moments to purify our faith, shape our character, and prepare us for His plans. And through it all, we hold on to the truth that God's purposes are always greater than our own, and His ways are always for our good, even when they involve hardship.